So today we've got Sulari Gentill in the shop. Her new book, third in the series, in the Rowland Sinclair series, is Miles Off Course. And I wanted to know where Rowland Sinclair came from.
Where his name came from?
Where the character and name came from.
The character evolved because I needed a protagonist that could move freely in 1930s society. So he necessarily had to be rich because we were in the midst of the Depression then, and I needed someone who didn't need to be burdened with having to work. I wanted him to move freely in between both elements of society, the left and the right. So he was born to the right, and he naturally gravitates to the left because he's an artist. But funnily enough, it was making him an artist that really made him come alive for me. And that's just because I paint, not at the level that Rowland paints at all. I just doodle, I fancy doodling, but I do understand painting, and I often say that I paint well enough to know that I should write, but I do understand how paint dries, and I do understand getting caught up in a painting, and how he sees the world, which is very much in terms of pictures and images and paintings. So when he looks at a scene, it's how he'll draw it, and when he studies someone and what he thinks is beautiful is in terms of line and shape and contour. And once I had that, then I was almost channeling Rowling, and he became very easy to write.
One of the first things I really noticed in the very first book, which is called A Few Right-Thinking Men, which is a great title because I keep saying A Few Good-Thinking Men and then I correct myself, is the way he looks at people's faces and the crowd scenes and those soapbox kind of scenes with the communists and that I could really picture his drawings of people with hats and the suits and that kind of stuff. And I wondered, who your favourite artist from the period is, from the 1930s.
Funnily enough, I have a real attraction to some of the more modernists and artists and the Impressionists. I love de Bell's work. He's a little bit later on, but some of his earlier paintings have that wonderful layering that's more than what you see. And the interesting thing about that period is with the advent of photography, people didn't need accurate records so much of what exactly people look like. So a painting needed to be more than a photograph. And I think that's what Rowland's talent conveys. And that's what, in my heart or my mind, that's what his talent did. He was able to grasp a bit of the essence of a person when he painted them. So it made him look very carefully at people and past their physical features and what they were wearing to what made them who they were.
And I want to know why you're so fascinated with that period of time. Is it because it so fundamentally changed Australia, or?
Well, look, to be honest, the decision to write in that period of time initially was a perfectly pragmatic decision. My husband is an historian, and his specialty is the far right-wing movements of the 1930s. So initially it was a way of bringing him into my world, because I live in my head so much. I was starting to realise that we were separated for a great period of the time because I was off in another world. And so I looked for something to write that could bring him into my world, because I wasn't coming out of my head very often. But once I actually started delving into this area of expertise of his, which I had ignored previously, I became fascinated with the passions that were around the period. It was a really tumultuous time in terms of politics, in terms of social upheaval, in terms of the development of the Australian identity. It was a time when we were starting to really come to grips with what it meant to be Australian rather than colonial or British. So it was that wonderful wander of the period where people were trying different things. As much as the 30s were a conservative period, and the establishment was conservative and there were social norms that were very rigid, it was also a time where people were willing to look at things differently and to try things differently. So you had things like the Theosophical movement that was getting momentum. You had people questioning old values, and you had the flappers coming up, and young people doing things that were scandalous. At the same time, the establishment was still there, trying to hang on to the old world, and it was out of that that the Australian identity was born.
And one of the things I really loved about the second book was the fact that once I started doing research into the Theosophy Society, that it was all true.
Yes.
So many of your characters in your books are real, and it really impressed me and certainly brought authenticity to the stories. But I just wondered how you know all of this stuff, and who does your fact-checking? Who does your research?
Well, I do my research and my fact-checking. I'm lucky in that I have this wealth of knowledge in the bed next to me, and I ask him quite often, and quite often he will direct me to an interesting part of that period, and I'll start digging. But the way that I write is I start writing and I research as the story evolves. So my novels are very much rooted in story and character, and the history feeds the story and the character. But that being said, there were so many wonderful, larger-than-life figures and events of that time that a lot of what I do is finding these magnificent people and these magnificent events in history and finding a way to link them all together in a story. And so it just adds that richness and colour. But I think one of the reasons why it's so easy for me is because I find it so fascinating and so interesting, and I'm so overjoyed when I find these wonderful nuggets of gold in this minefield of history. And I want to bring it to light because I'm so delighted with it, and I hope, if anything, I hope that comes through in my writing, how much I love this period and how much I love the history.
I think it does. I think your passion comes across quite easily. But each chapter has a heading from a newspaper, and all of those newspapers are credited and they're all listed. And I want to know whether you say you've got your lovely characters and you find the facts or you find the truth in the period, and then you weave the story around them. But where do you get those nuggets of newspaper from? Is it you then do your research and you go to that newspaper and find it?
Well, one of the things that I discovered in the whole editing process when the book was in manuscript form is that some of the things that happened in the 1930s were so unbelievable that people didn't believe they actually happened. They thought I was just going too far and making up some rubbish. And so I realised that it was necessary not only to be correct, absolutely correct when you're writing historical fiction, but to belt and brace it so that your reader knew that you were correct, because you don't have the opportunity to argue with the reader and say, no, it is right, I didn't make that up.
Then what's a plot against the government?
Exactly. And so the way I did that was to include these actual newspaper articles from the period to almost support some of the actual events that I wove into the storyline that may have seemed far-fetched when you read it. And so, there's those newspaper excerpts are discovered or found after the actual story is written. So once the manuscript is fully written, I go back and I find the appropriate article to fit in.
What's the next one going to be?
The next one is called Paving the New Road. And in that book, Rowley finds himself in Munich in 1933. So it has more of an international flavour. Now, I won't tell you why he finds himself in Munich.
Because Edna shot him again?
No. I can only have her shoot him once. that would be taking a license a little bit too far, I think. But he does find himself in Munich with Edna and Milton and Clive. Of course. In 1933, Germany and Munich was again a hotbed with the rise of fascism. Hitler had become chancellor in early 1933. The SA, or the brown shirts, were wandering around causing havoc. We saw hints and the start of what was going to evolve into the horrific Nazi regime that it became. And I wanted to put Rowland in that place. Because, as you know, he's very determinedly unpolitical. And part of my fun in writing this series is to poke him and prod him and put him in situations wondering when he's actually going to take a stand and see what he does. And And I say poke and prod because Rowland is his own man now, and I can't make him do things that are out of character, and he'll do what he'll do, and I just have to prod and poke and see what happens.
Oh well, I look forward to reading about his stand.
Thank
or
you.
Not.
Or not.
Thanks for your time, Sulari. Good luck with the novel.
Thank you very much.